Bro really showed up after the game was already over. The heroine had already reached her bad ending, lost everything, and had nowhere to go, so he decided to rewrite her story instead. So with that said, let's begin the story. The Magic of Bonds and the Holy Soiree, or Kizu for short, was a game in which the heroine, Fina, who possessed sacred magic, was admitted to the Royal Academy despite being a commoner. Only members of the nobility were admitted to this institution. There, she forged bonds with key characters. Ultimately, after defeating the final boss, she married one of them. It was an RPG-style Otome game with a rags-to-riches theme. What made it famous, however, was that it was an utsuge, that is, a genre of visual novels with a depressing tone. The reason for this was the bad ending on her route. To unlock this route, she was not allowed to reach a certain relationship level with any of the characters and had to start her second year with low popularity among her friends. Because her sacred magic was hated and considered repulsive, dark magic, she became the victim of brutal bullying, was forced to drop out of the academy, and vanished into the night. Some even began to say that this depressing scenario was actually the game's true ending. Ash Laban was a Japanese man who had been reborn into the world of Kiziru. One day, when he turned 10, he got his hands on a map and a guidebook to set out for the dungeon. As he pored over the guidebook, he studied what the monsters looked like and thought to himself that he wanted to go there someday. However, he immediately thought that it would be safer to defeat a flying lizard using brute force, remembering that water was its weakness. He wondered, how'd he know that? Suddenly, he remembered playing Kiziru in his past life. Comparing the situation to his memories, he realized that the Laban family into which he had been reborn were baronets, the lowest rank of the aristocracy. He was born the second son of this family, and his standing, both among the nobility and at home, was rock bottom. However, in a sense, he was lucky. He could enjoy the freedom that heirs were denied, and he thought enthusiastically about being able to go to the dungeon as much as he wanted. But there was one difference from a game. There was no character named Ash Laban in Kiziru. However, there was a more serious problem. He couldn't for the life of him remember the female lead's face. He wondered, what path was this world taking now? And did Fina even exist? He had seen the capture targets at the academy, so he knew for sure that this was the world of Kizu, but his unease remained. One day, while taking a shortcut to the dorm, he noticed that the rain had gotten heavier. Suddenly, he saw a girl sitting in the rain and was very surprised. He immediately realized she was a student at their academy and wondered if she was there because she was being bullied. Ash approached her, pointing out that she'd catch a cold if she stayed there. The girl asked him not to bother her. She was sitting there of her own free will. Ash sighed. He took off his jacket, and he handed her the umbrella and jacket, telling her to keep them. He added that she didn't need to return them, and then simply walked away. The next morning, Ash noticed with annoyance that no matter how much he leveled up, his immunity wasn't increasing. However, he calmed down, deciding to himself that as long as he didn't cause any trouble, he'd get by even with his absences, so he didn't care either way. Suddenly, there was a knock at the door, and he asked irritably, "Who's there?" reminding them that class was still in session. He reluctantly opened the door. Standing on the threshold was that same girl. She greeted him and said she'd come to return his jacket. He was surprised. How did she know his name and room number? She explained that she'd found a card in his pocket. She had wanted to leave it with the security guard, but when she heard he was in his room, she decided to come in person. He started brushing her off, asking her to leave quickly so he wouldn't infect her, and in a panic, he noticed that his temperature seemed to have spiked. At that very moment, he began to fall forward from weakness, losing his balance. The girl caught him. He apologized to her. She asked if he had a fever. She added that things couldn't go on like this. She suggested they go to the bedroom. He agreed, bewildered. The girl leaned over Ash, who was lying on the bed, and asked if he had any fever reducers. With his face buried in the pillow, he briefly shook his head. Hearing this, Fina paused for a moment, then quietly said she understood and asked him to close his eyes, apologizing in advance if it would be uncomfortable. Ash obediently closed his eyes. Standing over him, the girl pressed her palms together and held them over his chest. Feeling a strange warmth and relief, the boy opened his mouth in surprise and asked, "What kind of magic is this?" He felt the weakness and sore throat gradually recede. After a while, Fina lowered her hands, calmly noting that the fever had subsided and that she was now about to leave. Ash sat up abruptly from the bed, reached out his hand, and tried to stop her, hurriedly saying that he had to thank her for her help. However, the girl shook her head and replied that his words were enough for her, just as she had told him yesterday. At that moment, a loud sound rang out in the silence of the room. Fina suddenly tensed up, covered her mouth with her hand, and a noticeable blush spread across her face. She asked, embarrassed and apologetic, if he had heard that rumbling sound. Ash was taken aback for a moment, but quickly regained his composure and said with a smile that he'd actually been planning to grab a bite to eat himself, and invited her to eat with him. Fina was slightly flustered, but then nodded in agreement. At the same time, she sternly warned him that a sick person shouldn't stand at the stove and declared that she would prepare everything herself. Ash looked at her in surprise again, but nodded in agreement. Soon the girl returned with a large wooden tray holding a hot clay pot and a bowl. She crouched down by the low table and apologized for keeping him waiting. Ash thanked her for her efforts. Fina, looking sheepishly at the food, admitted she didn't know if it had turned out tasty. When the lid was lifted, Ash saw an appetizing hot dish from which thick steam was rising. The young man eagerly picked up his spoon, and after tasting the first bite, he immediately exclaimed with delight that it was damn delicious. He held out the plate to the girl. Fina asked if she could really have some. Ash nodded approvingly. He wished her bon appetit. However, when the girl brought the spoon to her mouth, her eyes suddenly filled with tears. Ash, noticing this, asked anxiously, "What's wrong?" The girl blinked rapidly, swallowing a lump in her throat, and explained in a trembling voice that it was simply because she hadn't eaten anything hot in a very long time. Watching her, Ash frowned, thoughtfully propping his chin on his hand. He remembered the pitiful state she'd been in, sitting in the alley in the rain, and mentally noted that something serious must have happened to her. The guys continued to devour their food in silence. After a while, Ash noticed that the pot was empty. He grunted and noticed that she had gone quiet. He looked up and saw that Fina had lowered her head and closed her eyes wearily, her hands folded quietly in her lap. After a moment of silence, Ash realized she had simply fallen asleep. Squinting slightly, he whispered that she'd probably relaxed too much. The next day, in the academy courtyard, Ash was participating in a training sword fight. A sharp lunge rang out, accompanied by a battle cry, and his opponent collapsed to the ground with a muffled groan. The referee loudly announced that Ash Laban was the winner. His friend Ein, a fair-haired guy wearing the same academic uniform with a fur collar, approached him. He whistled admiringly upon noticing that Ash had taken down 3 opponents in a row and called him cool. Ash nodded casually, confirming that was indeed the case. The friends walked over to a stone wall. Standing face to face, they exchanged a few words. Ash admitted that, for some reason, he'd been feeling much better lately than he had in the past few years. Ein smiled in response, saying that he was his friend, but yesterday, when Ash was lying flat on the ground, he'd actually felt a little embarrassed for him, and today he was already taking everyone down. Ash mentally replayed the events of the previous evening. And it was true, just yesterday, he'd had a hard time even standing when Fina was holding him in her arms. Thinking of her, Ash realized he'd woken up early today. The girl was still asleep, so he carefully left his room key along with a short note on the door and slipped out quietly, hoping she'd had a chance to rest. Later, in the academy dining hall, he and his friend sat down at a long wooden table covered with trays of food. Ein asked what Ash was having for lunch. Ash replied that he'd have the curry with a cutlet. While they were eating, Ein, gesturing animatedly, suddenly steered the conversation toward the latest news, asking if Ash knew about yesterday's event. Ash, folding his arms across his chest, asked in surprise, "What event?" Ein announced with a serious expression that His Highness Albert's engagement had been officially announced yesterday. Ash choked on his breath and let out a surprised exclamation. Alberich is the second prince of this country. Ash was very surprised because he recognized the name from the game. The prince was listed as one of the capture targets in Kiziru. He grew wary and asked who exactly the prince was engaged to. Ein replied that it was Elise Ringstadt. Ash was puzzled, since he didn't know this girl, and there was no such character in the game. He asked if she was the duke's daughter. Ein, however, replied that the point wasn't that, but rather that the bride came from a family of baronets, a rank just as low as their own. Ash frowned in confusion. At this academy, the upper and lower nobility are divided into different classes. Classes are held separately, so it's practically impossible for them to cross paths. Ash exclaimed in surprise. Where on earth could they have met? And how is that even possible? Ash noted that, according to rumors, the girl had transferred to the upper nobility class upon her engagement. But at that moment, Ein paused, pointed toward the open stone archway, and told Ash to look that way. They both turned around. Behind the archway, on a raised platform with wrought iron chairs, sat a couple. The young man, a fair-haired handsome fellow with a regal bearing, and the girl beside him, who was holding a basket of sandwiches. The girl smiled as she offered him the treats, saying that she'd made the sandwiches in the basket today and hoped he'd like them. The prince replied with a gentle look that he'd be happy with anything she'd prepared. Ash and his friend stared wide-eyed at this idyllic scene. Ash remarked skeptically that these sandwiches were, after all, from the cheapest lunch menu, to which his friend chuckled ironically, saying that this was apparently what they called love makes you lose your mind. They walked back to the common area with their trays in hand, and Ein asked where they would sit. As he did so, he glanced in that direction again and noticed that Fina, judging by the looks of it, had come to class as if nothing had happened after yesterday's situation. Ash suggested they join someone else, and Ein replied that he didn't mind. However, at that moment, they spotted Fina sitting at a table in the back. A tall, blonde student with a contemptuous expression approached her. He began yelling at Fina, calling her a worthless outcast and a fool who was bringing shame to the noble academy. Ash stood a little ways off, holding a tray, and recognized these students. At the academy, only the highest nobility have patterns on the cuffs of their uniforms, so students from the lower nobility call them sleeve wearers, and the latter, in turn, call the former sleeveless. Meanwhile, the student with the cuffs launched into a new barrage of insults at Fina. He shouted that a witch like her should disappear as soon as possible, and he demanded that she not dare ignore him. He fiercely gripped the hilt of his sword, shouting that he would show her right then and there where she belonged. Ash slammed the tray down. Without saying a word, he burst into the space between the aggressor and Fina. Standing with his back to the girl and facing the aggressor, he raised his blade and perfectly intercepted his opponent's swing, blocking the blow. Metal clanged in the silence of the dining hall. The student, frozen in rage, cursed, calling Ash a scoundrel. Ash looked at him coldly and asked mockingly if he realized what he was doing. Ash was well aware that he was standing up for the girl who was being harassed by some scumbags. The student roared and tried to land another blow, but Ash deftly dodged it. He spun sharply and kicked the sword out of the student's hands. Then he landed a blow to the student's torso. With a loud crack, the student in handcuffs staggered, and he collapsed face down onto the stone floor. The dining hall fell silent for a moment. Ash, standing over his defeated opponent, caught his breath and, wiping the sweat from his forehead, muttered to himself that he was, it turned out, still in excellent shape. Onlookers had already begun to gather around. One of the guys from a victim's group gasped and started shouting that the sleeveless guy dared to fight the sleeved ones. Noticing that the situation was drawing attention, the protagonist called out to Ein, his best friend, who was muttering something about how Ash had gone too far this time, that he apologized, but was leaving the whole situation up to him. Ignoring any objections, he ran over to Fina, effortlessly scooped her up in his arms, and headed for the exit of the cafeteria and then out of the academy. Ein called out to his friend and shouted that he'd have to explain everything to him tomorrow. Once they were outside the academy, Fina, still in Ash's arms, asked shyly for him to put her down. Ash gently set her down on the cobblestones. Fina, looking away, asked for the umpteenth time why he was doing so much for her. Ash sighed and replied that he simply couldn't leave her there alone. The girl quietly said she understood. A look of surprise and a hint of sadness flashed across her face. Ash looked around and realized that, in any case, their school uniform stood out too much in the middle of the city, and they'd be better off changing. He suggested they go to his family's mansion, which was nearby. Fina agreed without hesitation. They approached the massive wooden doors. Ash pushed the door open slightly, gestured for her to come in, and announced that they had arrived. Fina crossed the threshold and froze. Her eyes widened in shock, and a bead of sweat rolled down her cheek. Inside, the room was in complete chaos. Overturned furniture, scattered wooden crates, broken chairs, and piles of junk. She asked in horror what could have possibly happened to reduce the house to such a state. And where were the servants? Ash casually replied that, for a number of reasons, no one was there. He rubbed the back of his head and explained, with a hint of embarrassment, that the mess was simply the result of him being too lazy to sell the loot from the dungeon. Fina, surveying the mountains of trash, abruptly changed the subject and sternly asked where the cleaning supplies were. Ash asked in surprise, "Why do you need them?" The girl, clenching her fists and looking at him with a slight tremor in her voice, exclaimed that they needed to clean up this house immediately because living in a place like this was harmful to one's health. Ash tried to object, saying that he usually lived in a dorm and didn't really need a house, to which Fina immediately countered with a question. What if the dorm becomes unavailable? What would you do then? Ash, pausing to think for a moment, shrugged and replied that he'd probably end up living in a shed in the backyard. Fina refused to listen to his nonsense and firmly declared that they needed to start cleaning right away. She adjusted her uniform, and Ash asked if she was okay wearing just an apron. Fina nodded, saying she was perfectly comfortable and had no problems. Then she cheerfully suggested they get it over with as soon as possible. Ash, as he cleared away the broken furniture in the corner, admitted guiltily that he was ashamed to admit it, but he was to blame for the mess. As they tidied up, Ash, holding a wooden box, looked thoughtfully at Fina, who was wiping dust off the cabinet. The thought flashed through his mind that she, too, seemed to be wearing a sleeves uniform, and he wondered why. Then, they hated her so much. The cleaning continued. At one point, Fina, standing on a tall stepladder and trying to reach the top shelf, suddenly swayed. Ash looked up and saw the hem of her short skirt flutter upward. He blushed fiercely, and a panicked thought flashed through his mind. Could he see her underwear? And should he say something? Fina placed some books under the ladder, but the ladder wobbled, and it flew straight at her. Ash cried out, warning her. Reacting instantly, he rushed forward and caught her. Fina thanked him. Ash cleared his throat and said it was his fault. He hadn't been watching her closely enough, and hurriedly asked if she was hurt. Fina lowered her gaze and thought about how he'd shielded her with his body, and asked if he was hurt anywhere. Ash, trying to stay calm, replied that he was fine and offered to check if anything had fallen off the shelves. Fina, biting her lip and looking around, quietly added that she was ready to help too. However, their position remained extremely awkward. Fina asked him, somewhat embarrassed, to move aside a little. In response, there was only a quiet nod of agreement. He apologized to the girl, and she reminded him that she hadn't been careful herself. Ash gently remarked that, since they were already in such an awkward position, they might as well discuss something else. The girl looked at him in bewilderment. Ash smiled innocently and remarked that her underwear had been visible for quite some time. Fina, taken aback for a moment, let out a loud scream, and then, blushing crimson with embarrassment, cried out, "Why didn't he tell me about this sooner?" After a while, the room sparkled with cleanliness, and Fina, looking around with satisfaction at the transformed space, sighed with relief, noticing that it looked completely different. Fina asked him to clean up here regularly. Ash smiled, changed the subject, and asked, "What about dinner?" The girl, frowning slightly, replied that she had the feeling he was trying to force the topic on her. After a moment's pause, Fina suddenly asked if she could take a shower. Ash, taken aback, replied that she could, but asked if she wasn't afraid to shower at a guy's house. The girl, keeping a completely impassive expression, snapped that after he'd carried her in his arms and had already seen her underwear, she didn't care. Ash, realizing his slip-up, scratched the back of his head guiltily and apologized for his stupidity. Fina suddenly turned to face him. A warm smile returned to her face, and she apologized for teasing him, but she really didn't care. Then, turning away and waving her hand, she said she'd go take a shower. And at that moment, like a bolt of lightning, a memory flashed through Ash's mind. He remembered that she was the main character, Fina. When he thought about how she had instantly cured his cold yesterday, it was holy magic, available only to Fina. So, the high nobility treated her that way precisely because holy magic had already been labeled darkness. Didn't that mean the story branch he'd ended up in was heading straight for a bad ending? Ash, staring at the door that had closed behind her, mentally shook his head and exhaled with relief that everything had finally fallen into place. Standing in the hallway and mulling over the situation, Ash recalled that the bad ending route in Kizuru was radically different from other Otome games. It wasn't that the game ended with the credits immediately after the bad ending. On the contrary, even after entering the bad ending route, and right up until the very end of the main route, the heroine was forced to live under the weight of contempt and insult from all the characters around her. He understood that it was like a video game. If you deleted the save data halfway through, your leveled up stats and all your progress would be lost. So, whether he wanted to or not, he had to keep playing. This caused pain not only to Fina herself, but also to the player. That's exactly why Kizuru was popularly known as a depressing game. At that moment, the creak of the bathroom door opening could be heard. Fina stepped out into the hallway, already changed into her usual uniform. Ash, standing against the wall with his arms crossed, wondered if they were now following that very ill-fated scenario. The girl approached him and, lowering her gaze, thanked him for letting her use the shower. Ash waved his hand, telling her not to worry about it, and added that he'd rather say something else. He looked at her intently and asked, "You're Fina Stott, right?" The girl flinched, her eyes widening in surprise. Astonished, she asked how he knew her name. Ash calmly replied that last year there had been rumors about a commoner who had enrolled in a class for the high nobility, possessing incredible magic. Then he remarked that, come to think of it, those rumors had quickly died down precisely because she had already entered the route leading to the bad ending. The girl looked away, embarrassed, and asked him not to worry about it. She looked up at him again and, with a slight tremor in her voice, admitted that she was sorry for hiding her name. Ash replied that that was perfectly fine. However, watching her smile and try to appear carefree, Ash felt he had made a mistake. He thought he didn't want her to look like that. Sighing, he decided it was too late anyway and offered to let her stay at his place tonight. Fina, lowering her gaze, quietly replied that, since that was the case, she would gratefully accept his offer. The next morning, Ash gave a light knock and flung open the door to his room. Stepping inside, he greeted Fina. He quickly scanned the room. The room was completely empty. On the table lay only a sheet of paper folded in half. Ash picked it up and read the farewell letter. It said that she was sorry for hiding her true identity and dragging him into her problems, and that she was leaving immediately. Ash cursed under his breath, realizing he should have guessed that, in her current state, she would do exactly that. A thought flashed through his mind. If everything went according to the bad ending scenario, he didn't want to see Fina suffer the way she had back then, in the rain, and how her smile would fade. Ash immediately headed to the academy. As he approached the main entrance, he saw a huge crowd of students gathered on the porch. He wondered anxiously, what's this crowd about? And he realized he needed to find Fina as soon as possible. He pushed his way through the crowd, ignoring someone's mocking remarks that commoners were incapable of remembering their own actions. Fina was the center of attention, with a whole group of guys towering over her. Ash recognized them with astonishment. They were His Highness Alberich, the son of one of the kingdom's finest generals, and the unrivaled spearman Eugene Grime. Recon Arbak, the son of the court's chief mage and a genius wizard, and David Venus, the son of the Minister of Finance, a charismatic manager who, even as a student, had already led several trading companies. Ash realized that these were the very 4 knights who were the capture targets in the game. However, it wasn't just their presence that caught Ash's attention, but also the way Alberich was holding a young woman tightly around the shoulders. Ash looked at her in bewilderment. At that moment, Alberich, addressing Fina, declared that he would not tolerate a witch like her at the academy, one who had tormented Elise and tried to kill everyone with evil magic. Fina, her voice filled with despair, tried to defend herself, insisting she had done nothing of the sort. Recon pointed a finger at her and shouted that she was still pretending to be innocent, declaring that no one but her could have stolen Elise's belongings, and that the academy had no use for someone who harmed others for their own gain. Elise couldn't take it anymore and stepped in. She turned to Alberich and said that Fina wasn't to blame, because she herself might be the villain. Alberich replied that it was impossible for such a kind girl, who had healed them so many times, to be capable of evil. Hearing this, Ash clenched his fists and growled through gritted teeth that it was time to put an end to this cheap charade, and he would do so by force. Standing beneath the gloomy sky, Ash silently raised a small wand. In the next second, the sky darkened abruptly, and a torrential downpour poured down on the square. Panic broke out in the crowd. The students screamed, wondering where such a sudden downpour had come from. They cursed that they couldn't see a thing and demanded shelter immediately. Amid the roar of the downpour, a voice rang out, calling for Elise to take cover. Alberich and the other knights, panicked, began scattering in search of shelter, shielding their heads from the rain. In the commotion, Ash grabbed the stunned Fina, who was standing nearby, by the hand and shouted for her to run after him. They ran into some kind of shelter. Ash stood by the window, watching the rain lashing against the glass. Fina asked why he had saved her again. Ash, wiping his wet hair, replied that he'd already said it before. He couldn't leave her alone. He added that, besides, right now, she seemed to be heading straight for her own doom. The girl was surprised. Ash glanced at her so close and said they needed to do something about them. Fina was a little embarrassed and replied that there was no need. She raised her hand and touched Ash's chest. Whispering the short spell blessing, she instantly dried his wet clothes and hair. Ash, looking at her, asked thoughtfully if this was the magic that had been the subject of rumors. Fina glanced at him and explained that it was a holy magic technique called blessing, capable of purifying the body of impurity, and, according to rumors, she was the only one who possessed it. Ash paused for a moment, then cautiously asked if this magic, and the girl named Elise, had anything to do with the fact that they were bullying her. He realized he was stirring up her painful past, but he firmly added that in order to fix the current situation, he needed to know what had happened up until now. Ash gently clasped her hands and prepared to hear her answer. Fina sighed heavily and quietly said that she understood. She warned him that her story would be long and asked if he minded. Ash replied that he was listening carefully. The girl began her story from her very childhood. From an early age, she had possessed a mysterious power capable of instantly healing any wounds or illnesses. She explained that Mother Hilda, who had lovingly raised her at the orphanage, she had always instructed her not to use this power without permission, and she allowed her to use it only on the seriously wounded, whom ordinary potions could not help. So Fina lived peacefully at the orphanage on the outskirts of town. However, 3 years ago, everything changed. While venturing into the mountains in search of medicinal herbs, she stumbled upon a severely wounded man. Disregarding Mother Hilda's instructions, the girl decided to heal him. The man was greatly surprised by her power and began asking her about it, wanting to thank her. When he asked her name, Fina replied that she had simply done what she was supposed to do. The man smiled and said that she had become even more interesting to him, and after saying that, he went down the mountain, leaving her alone. A year later, Fina Stott was granted admission to the Royal Academy of Magic as a special exception. She gladly accepted, believing that with this power, she would be able to save many people. However, at the academy, which accepted only nobles, people immediately began to look askance at her, a commoner. The only one who spoke to her was a girl named Elise. Fina admitted that they became so close that she immediately told her new friend about her power. But soon, Elise began to show a strange concern about her schedule. Fina never could have imagined that, before she knew it, she had begun living according to a schedule entirely devised by Elise. Soon, rumors began to spread throughout the academy that Fina was threatening Elise with dark magic, and everyone around them kept insisting that commoners were a nightmare. In reality, Elise wasn't just spreading malicious rumors. She was also treating the wounds of His Highness Alberich and the others, using a huge amount of ordinary potions to do so. By the time Fina finally realized what was happening, it was already too late. She was surrounded on all sides, being called a witch and a villain. The final straw came when, during field exercises, she cast a blessing of protection on the boys who were unaccustomed to actual battles with monsters. Instead of gratitude, they accused her of using a vile power and attempting to kill them all. The girl was strictly ordered never to use that terrifying power in front of them again. Sometime later, Elise and the others gathered before her once more. They declared that her barbaric behavior had crossed all boundaries and they could no longer tolerate it, and threatened to personally expel her from the academy. In tears, Fina tried to defend herself, insisting that she really hadn't done anything. However, they warned her that if she continued to feign innocence, they would have to destroy the orphanage that had raised such a villain. Fina's desperate pleas were in vain. She was ordered to leave the academy immediately. The girl woke up, already crying, in an alley in the capital. And it was at that very moment that Ash called out to her. Ash thanked her for her story, and he noted to himself with surprise that everything up until her admission to the academy matched the plot of the original game exactly, and that the man she had rescued in the mountains was none other than Crown Prince Elsa's. He also realized that the problem lay with Elise. In the original game, Fina healed her targets with her holy magic and piqued their interest, but here, Elise had likely faked holy magic using potions, taken control of Fina's actions, and stolen her role. Ash concluded that it was highly likely Elise was a reincarnator just like himself, since pulling off something like that would be impossible without knowledge of the game. Fina thanked Ash for saving her so many times, but she firmly stated that she would cause him even more trouble if she stayed, so she decided to leave. Ash asked sharply if she was okay with having lost to Elise and the others. The girl, pausing for a moment to think, exclaimed that of course she wasn't okay with it, but she had no way to protect the shelter or prove her innocence. Ash, noticing that her fighting spirit hadn't faded, smiled, and he confidently declared that, in that case, he would lead her to victory. Fina, hearing his words, widened her eyes in astonishment. Ash asked her to trust him and follow him. The girl pressed her fist to her chest and asked hopefully to be allowed to win. Ash firmly promised that he would free her from humiliation and suffering. The next day, at the academy, Ash ran into his friend Ein. Ein waved at him and remarked that it had been a while since they'd seen each other, since the day before yesterday, in fact. Ash apologized for everything that had happened in the cafeteria and changed the subject. He mentioned that he'd noticed the students around him had started to keep their distance, and thought they were clearly avoiding him. Ein remarked, almost in passing, that this was only natural. After all, he'd gotten into a fight, and after an incident like that, he was in for it. Ash sighed and agreed that he understood. Ein added that classes had been canceled altogether yesterday due to a sudden downpour. Ash was secretly glad that no one had figured out it was his doing. Ash thought about his plan. Given what had happened, he decided he'd done the right thing by letting Fina rest at the mansion. Besides, he needed to gather information about what was going on his own. Soon, Ein approached him again and began sharing the latest gossip. He said that Lady Elise meets with one of the four knights every day in the courtyard, taking turns with each one, and rumors are swirling that she's engaged to all of them at the same time. Ash paused to think for a moment. He recalled that in the original game, there was a special hidden reverse harem route where you could become engaged to all four target characters at the same time. He realized that Elise was currently following exactly that path. Ash also concluded that she undoubtedly knew about the game, and all that remained was to find out whether she was truly a reincarnator. Later, Ash decided to follow Elise. He assumed that before lunch, she would be picking up her culinary masterpieces from the cafeteria. Ein was surprised by his interest, and Ash briefly replied that he simply thought, since she was at the center of the rumors, it was worth checking out. Upon entering the cafeteria, he saw Elise looking at the sandwiches. Ash approached her, apologized for disturbing her, and asked if she was Lady Elise Ringstadt. The young woman turned around in surprise. Elise exclaimed that it was indeed her, and Ash smiled as he congratulated her on her engagement to the second prince. Elise replied that she was pleased to receive congratulations from someone like him. She then asked if the downpour that had happened yesterday was in honor of this event. Ash realized he'd been caught. Feigning embarrassment, he began to apologize, explaining that his magic had gotten out of control during training and that he hadn't meant to hurt anyone. Elise smiled, noting that it seemed to her as if he were defending that good-for-nothing girl. Ash smiled and said that she was, after all, engaged to His Highness Alberich, and now she was the hope of all the sleeveless ones. She added that people say she's practically a modern-day Cinderella or Princess Kaguya. Elise noted with a smile that she was flattered when people called her that. Ash asked how she had met Alberich in the first place. Elise thought for a moment and replied that she was probably just lucky because she happened to be the very girl who had kindly set an example for him. Ash asked what she meant by that. Elise, looking slightly embarrassed, said that he might not understand and apologized. Then Ash, as if in passing, asked if she was bothered by the taunts from that commoner student named Fina. Elise gasped, covered her face with her hands, and said plaintively that it had been very hard for her. She explained that Fina was jealous of her relationship with Alberich, spread nasty rumors, and stole and broke her belongings. Ash nodded sympathetically and said that it must have been very hard for her. Elise smiled again and replied that everything was fine now. Then, raising her hand to her lips with a satisfied look, Elise told Ash that His Highness Alberich had already spoken with the dean, and as a result, Fina would be handed a notice of expulsion tomorrow and would leave the academy. Ash realized he needed to wrap up the conversation. He said he understood everything and thanked Elise for her time. The girl waved her hand, saying it was no big deal, and wished him good luck. Ash stepped away from her and mentally summed it up. There could be no mistake. Elise was definitely a reincarnator. He also knew that in this world, there were no fairy tales about Cinderella or Princess Kaguya, and anyone born here would be surprised by such names, and she knew that. So, the very example she'd shown the prince was part of the game's main storyline. After mentally piecing together all the information, Ash decided that all that was left was to fight. Upon returning to the mansion, he found Fina in a state of panic. She had just learned of her forced expulsion. Ash confirmed that Elise had gone so far as to do that. He proposed a plan. They would declare that the reason stated in the notice was a lie and prove her innocence through a duel. After all, in this country, any decision can be overturned by staking everything on a battle, which is why duels are valued above all else. Even members of the royal family and the aristocracy would lose their dignity if they refused to participate. Fina was desperately doubtful, since these four knights were already recognized as masters, and she wouldn't be able to match them. Ash reassured her, saying he had no intention of forcing her to fight alone, but warned that she would still have to put in some effort. Ash asked Fina if she was ready for this. The girl replied that she was, if it was within her power. Ash nodded and remarked that since she understood everything, so tomorrow they would proceed according to plan, and Fina readily agreed. The next day, a large crowd had gathered at the academy's entrance. Alberich and his companions stood before them. Alberich, looking at Fina, declared contemptuously that she never seemed to tire and that she appeared to have absolutely no aptitude for learning. Eugene, who was standing nearby, added irritably that this was going too far, but Alberich stopped him, saying that was enough. He then addressed Fina directly. He accused her of endangering the other students with her evil magic and tormenting Elise with slanderous rumors. He declared that the existence of a villain like her brought dishonor to the Royal Academy, and for that reason, he ordered her to be expelled. Fina, cowering, muttered, "Is that the reason she's being expelled?" Alberich confirmed it once more. Then Fina stepped forward and firmly declared that the claims regarding her expulsion were a vile lie. To prove it, she challenged His Highness to a duel. Alberich and the others were taken aback at first. Someone in the crowd mockingly remarked that she probably thought she could defeat the top students based on the general exam results. He added that even with her dark magic, she was alone here. But Ash calmly stepped forward and said he would team up with Fina. Alberich looked at Ash with contempt and asked who he even was. Ash introduced himself as the second son of the Laban family. Alberich asked dismissively, "What kind of family is that?" Ash replied that they were of the lower nobility, and he probably didn't know them. Alberich asked if Ash understood what it meant to challenge him to a duel. Ash confidently replied that of course he did. Recon explained that the duel would be between the four of them and the two of them, and asked if that was acceptable to them. Ash asked sarcastically if they were okay with there being four of them. He added, "Shouldn't Lady Elise join in too?" Alberich shouted furiously that he wouldn't let Elise sully herself with scum like them. Ash smiled as he laid out their conditions. They demanded that the slanderous lies about Fina and the expulsion notice be retracted, that they apologize to her, and that they swear never again to harm her or anyone associated with her. Alberich, clenching his fists, replied that their demand was to expel them from this country. Ash asked mockingly, "So, are you ready to fight on those terms?" And Alberich asked spitefully, "Are you sure? Because if you lose, you'll be mercilessly thrown out, not just of the academy, but of the country." Ash turned to Fina and asked if she minded. The girl replied firmly that she had never intended to lose from the very beginning. Clenching her fist, she added that since things had come to this, she was ready. Seeing their determination, Alberich sarcastically proposed a match in the Academy's Coliseum in a week, promising to crush them to smithereens. A week passed. They stood at the entrance to the huge arena. Ash asked Fina if they had a plan for today's duel. Ash nodded, telling her to fight however she liked. The girl, nervously clenching her hands, replied that she would follow his instructions to the letter. In the arena, just before the fight began, Fina asked doubtfully if he was serious about their chances. Ash smiled and confirmed that they would win. In the arena, Alberich stood surrounded by his comrades. He declared arrogantly that in this duel, he would unleash the full might of his justice upon them, and he would dedicate his victory to Elise. Ash, standing next to Fina, confidently replied that they would definitely win because he was fighting alongside her. The referee loudly announced the start of the match. Without wasting a second, Ash ordered Fina to rely on him. Eugene, drawing a long spear and charging forward, shouted that he would knock all the arrogance out of them. Fina activated Light Barrier. Eugene's spear struck the transparent barrier with a dull thud. Eugene was surprised to find that it was a barrier. He struck again. He cursed and realized he couldn't break through it. Eugene swung again. Ash nodded. Fina cast Blessing of Protection and dispelled the barrier. Ash reacted instantly and charged at Eugene. He grabbed his spear and threw Eugene over his shoulder. Then he snapped his opponent's spear in two. At that very moment, another opponent silently approached Fina from the other side while she had her back turned. Ash immediately turned around, held out her palm, and reactivated the light barrier. The enemy slammed into the barrier at full speed and was sent flying backward. Ash turned to Fina and asked her to intensify her attack. Ash nodded gratefully and, noticing that the enemy was exposed, rapidly closed the distance. The blow landed squarely on the enemy's torso. The enemy gasped and collapsed to the ground. This result exceeded all expectations. It became clear that the training in the dungeon before today's duel had not been in vain. The secret wasn't just that he'd used his stash of rare items and leveled up effectively in a short time. He'd managed to get his hands on a sword that granted bonus experience. And for Fina, there was a unique amulet that reduced mana consumption for holy magic, and it turned out to be incredibly useful. However, the respite was short-lived. A huge stone golem suddenly rose in the center of the arena. When Fina saw it, she screamed in fear at Ash to step back, but it was too late. Recon loudly announced that he was now their opponent. Recon raised his staff, shouted the spell, and unleashed a powerful fireball at Ash. Ash managed to jump out of the way, but realized that the combination of the golem's heavy blows and Recon's magic was an extremely unpleasant mix. He exchanged a glance with Fina, and she asked if he could neutralize the golem and pull the mage down. Ash replied that he would need some backup, and Fina understood. When Recon fired another fireball, Ash lunged forward. He swung his sword and shouted, "Aqua Splash." Recon froze in amazement. He had never seen anyone cut through magic with a regular sword. Ash's technique wasn't just a simple strike. It was magical fencing infused with water. Water overpowers fire, and with Fina's buff, dispelling the spell turned out to be a piece of cake. An icy wave sliced through Recon's magic and then crashed into the stone golem with terrifying force. The golem's durability turned out to be surprisingly low. It looked like a tank, but in reality, it was as fragile as glass. The golem shattered into pieces, and the mage, losing his balance, fell to the ground. Fina ran to the spot where he had fallen, threw her arms up, and shouted, "Restraining magic." Recon, pinned to the floor by an invisible force, screamed in panic, not understanding what had happened. Ash, surveying the battlefield, noticed that the other two had also been neutralized and thought that Fina had done an excellent job. Meanwhile, in the stands where Elise was standing, a murmur began. One of the spectators remarked in surprise that it seemed they were actually winning, to which the others merely responded with uncertain silence. Elise, biting her finger, stared at Ash in complete disbelief. Her mind raced. Who is this guy? She stole the heroine's role from Fina, and everything was going so smoothly. Only one enemy remained in the arena. Recon, still lying on the floor, looked at Alberich in horror and exclaimed, "Could he have prepared that very weapon?" Alberich, ignoring him, replied with a smile that while they'd been stalling, he'd managed to accumulate enough royal mana. A sword flashed in his hands, and Ash realized that this weapon was charged with royal mana, and he thought that this simply couldn't be possible. A scene from the original game suddenly flashed before his eyes. In Kizu, the hero Aaron's beloved, Clea, who was the first Saint of Light, used a divine artifact to transform herself into a weapon, the sacred sword Clea. And thanks to this tragic sacrifice, it was possible to defeat the final boss. Ash recalled how the game had made him feel, how such a scene made players want to howl. And in his mind, he called the developers themselves sick scoundrels. He shifted his gaze to the sword in Alberich's hands and realized that only the lineage of the first king, that is, the hero's descendants, could wield the sacred sword of Clea. This legendary weapon had been passed down through the royal family. Moreover, the existence of this sword meant that the tragedy of the hero Eren and Saint Clea was not just a story within the game, but a real tragedy of this world. Ash clenched his fists. Rage overwhelmed him. He thought about how that monster was using Clea merely as a tool. He would not forgive them for their sacrifice or their honor. Standing up, he turned to Fina. He asked for her forgiveness, but declared that he needed her full blessing for protection. Sensing his state of mind, the girl replied excitedly that she understood. Ash was on the verge of losing his temper, and Fina, noticing that his anger had reached its limit, called out to him anxiously. Ash turned around and briefly thanked her for her support. Alberich, meanwhile, gripping his sword, declared with a smirk that his vile magic was powerless here, and added that Elise had told him no one could stand against this sacred sword. Ash threw down his sword. Alberich smiled and asked if he was afraid. He raised his blade high, intending to strike from above, and warned that there would be no mercy. But Ash stopped his blade with his hand. Alberich's eyes widened in shock. Then Ash struck him in the torso, and then to the face. Alberich howled in pain, and Ash stared at him with madness in his eyes, and continued to strike him in the face. Silence fell over the stands, and then anxious voices could be heard. Someone noticed that His Highness hadn't let go of his sword, while others asked in horror whether Alberich was even still alive. Ash swung his sword. Suddenly, Fina ran up to him, grabbed his hand, and, clutching it tightly, begged him to stop. She said that the outcome of the battle was already a foregone conclusion, and she didn't want to see his hands covered in blood. Ash apologized and admitted that the blood had probably gone to his head, and he'd likely gone too far. He thanked her for stopping him. Ash handed Clea's sword to the referee, and he announced that, given His Highness Alberich's inability to continue the fight, Fina Stott and Ash Laban were declared the winners. Fina cast Healing Blessing, Cure Connect on Ash's hand. She then asked him not to do anything foolish that would harm himself. Ash nodded and replied that he understood, and thanked her for her concern. Fina glanced at the injured boys. Her heart tightened. She raised her hands once more and chanted, Cure Field, spreading healing magic to everyone lying in the arena. Ash, looking at her, asked in surprise if she was sure about what she was doing. After all, she was helping the very people who had dragged her through the mud. Fina calmly replied that she didn't forgive them for what they'd done, but she couldn't just leave the wounded to die. Behind them, Alberich let out an angry shout. He declared that this match was some kind of mistake. They couldn't possibly have lost without scoring a single point, and their opponent was clearly cheating. A tall, dark-haired man in a black uniform approached him, his brother, Elsa's. He gave Alberich a cold look and said it was a pitiful sight. Elsa's turned to Ash and Fina. He bowed deeply and apologized for his foolish brother's disgraceful behavior, promising that Alberich would be immediately suspended and that an official verdict would be handed down later. After listening to him, Ash turned to Fina and asked what they would do. The girl, looking a little flustered, replied that she didn't know. Then, glancing at Elsa's, she asked him to clarify 2 points. She asked if Ash would face legal consequences because of the duel. Elsa's firmly replied that he would not, adding that Ash was a hero who had returned the crown's treasure and promised that if anyone tried to lay a finger on him, he would personally come to his defense. Fina smiled and accepted his apology. Then she looked intently at Elsa's and asked if they had met before. Elsa's frowned and replied that no, he was seeing her for the first time today. Ash was puzzled. He recalled that it was Elsa's who had signed Fina's admission form to the academy. Noticing Elsa's confusion, Fina apologized if the question had seemed strange. Elsa's laughed and said it was no big deal. Elsa's turned his gaze to his brother. He said that only a select few knew the location of the sacred sword Clea. Then he asked how Elise had found out about it, and how they'd managed to steal it. He then added that the Order of Knights would interrogate them with particular zeal, and they headed for the exit of the Colosseum. Ash watched them go and said they should leave them to His Highness. It was time for them to go. The girl agreed with him. They left the academy and headed to Ash's mansion in the city. Inside, pausing in the entryway, Ash asked Fina what she had meant when she asked Prince Elsa's that question. The girl, nervously fidgeting with her fingers, admitted that he seemed to her to resemble a man she had once saved in the mountains, but she must have been mistaken. She added that, unlike that man she had saved, His Highness frightened her and seemed as if he were not of this world. Ash thoughtfully raised his hand to his chin. He mentally pieced together the facts. If they'd met face to face and didn't recognize each other, then Fina was right, and it wasn't him. But then the game's plot would crumble at its very foundation. That thought wouldn't leave him alone. Fina hesitated. Lowering her gaze, She asked what he would do if she returned to the dorm. Ash replied that for now, he would live here and commute to the academy from the mansion, and since he'd messed up so badly, it would be best for him to lay low. Fina asked if he could handle the cleaning on his own. Ash admitted sheepishly that aristocrats don't clean up after themselves. They usually have a butler. But Fina pointed out that there was no one here right now and asked if that was true. Ash nodded. Then Fina asked if she could be his housekeeper. After all, they could live together. Ash was surprised. Fina suggested that she might get in his way and asked if that was true. Ash asked if she was uncomfortable with just living under the same roof as a guy like him. The girl assured him that she would never think anything bad of him. Then Ash, recalling the game mechanics, pointed out that there was an event in the game where the characters lived together for the purpose of a takeover, and that seemed canonical to him. He added that at the orphanage, Fina had bathed in the same tub as the little kids, and back then the players had joked, "Is she really that easygoing with guys too?" He pulled himself together and said in a businesslike tone that he understood, but on one condition: he would pay her a salary. Fina tried to object, saying that just having a roof over her head was enough for her. But Ash firmly stated that this was the minimum requirement for them to live together. The girl, a little flustered, agreed. Then Ash held out his hand to her and said that they had a deal. They would live together until things settled down. Fina happily shook his hand. Meanwhile, a completely different scene was unfolding in the royal castle. Eugene's parents, Recon and David, were kneeling before the king, who sat on his throne. With their heads bowed low, they begged for forgiveness and declared that they were ready to atone for their foolish sons' sins with their own lives. After all, the responsibility lay with them as parents, and they were asked how they intended to resolve this incident. Elsa stepped forward and reported that the most serious crime had been committed by his brother and Elise, who had incited him. They had used the royal family's name as a cover to steal a national treasure, and by law, this carried the death penalty. He then asked his father what should be done about the reward for the heroes who had returned the sword. The king asked Elsa's what he suggested. Elsa's replied that Fina's thought was worthy of the order of heroism. As for Ash Laban, he noted that it was unworthy for a man who had performed such a feat to remain a commoner simply because he was the second son of a baronet. He proposed granting him the title of Viscount Weiss, since that line of the family currently has no heirs. The king thoughtfully stroked his beard and remarked that, of course, many would be outraged, but the law did not prohibit it. General Grime, Eugene's father, was the first to clasp his hand to his chest and declare that he was wholly on his majesty's side. Arbak followed, supporting the general, while Venus asked permission to serve the king. Seeing their loyalty, the king proposed limiting the punishment for the three culprits to a stern reprimand, since such distinguished men were pleading on their behalf. Elsa's approved this decision, but he proposed his own punishment for Alberich and Elise. They must publicly apologize to Ash and Fina in the Academy's Great Hall, so that they would never be able to forget this humiliation for the rest of their lives. The king approved this and dismissed Elsa's, saying that he would make the final decision himself. A little later, Elsa's was sitting in his office. A courtier standing before him questioned the severity of the punishment. But Elsa's explained that Ash Laban possessed anomalous power, while Fina had awakened as a true saint. And for the country to prosper even 100 years from now, these two need enemies who can be eliminated at any moment. The courtier remarked that it seemed Elsa's had already unraveled Ash's secret. Elsa's walked over to the window and, looking out at the city, said that without proof, it was merely a theory. But in any case, by learning to fight back and overcome Ash, they will become the key to the country's survival in the future. He promised to spare no effort to lay that foundation. Several days had passed since Ash and Fina had started living together. One morning, sunlight flooded the room. Fina, already dressed in her uniform and a white apron, stood over Ash's bed and woke him up, telling him it was already morning. Ash, sleepily opening his eyes and rubbing his face, mumbled a sleepy "good morning" in response. A little later, standing at the front door of the mansion, Ash said goodbye to Fina, telling her he'd be leaving first. The girl, holding a basket of laundry, wished him a good day and added that she would finish the laundry and head to the academy as well. Ash knew that if rumors started spreading that the two participants in the scandalous duel lived in the same house, there would be no end to the trouble, so it was better for them to go to the academy separately. At the academy, Ash ran into his best friend, Ein. Ein waved at him cheerfully and, with a smirk, called him Mr. Ravager. Ash asked him not to call him that, but Ein pointed out that he'd been given a powerful nickname. You couldn't argue with that. After all, he'd single-handedly taken down all 4 knights, though the word Ravager was, of course, a bit of an exaggeration. Ash replied that, in any case, he was glad Ein was treating him as usual. Ein smiled and said that they'd known each other for 100 years, and he knew perfectly well that Ash wasn't the scoundrel the rumors made him out to be. Ash was moved to tears. He called Ein a true friend and tried to hug him, but Ein pulled away sharply, saying he wasn't into that sort of thing. At that moment, the girl who was the class representative approached them. She reported that the rector was summoning Ash for a hearing regarding the duel. Ein and Ash exchanged surprised glances. Ein assumed he was going to be reprimanded, but Ash pointed out that, given the deal with Prince Elsa's, it was unlikely anything serious awaited him. Ash entered the rector's office and politely apologized for the intrusion. In the office, amid tall bookshelves, sat the gray, bearded rector. Ash was surprised to see that Fina was there as well. Ash cautiously asked why they had been summoned. The rector replied that they shouldn't worry, since they hadn't done anything wrong. The rector began by addressing Fina. He apologized for having turned a blind eye until now to the vile lies and rumors that had been circulating about her. Fina, a little flustered, asked him to look her in the eye and said that she was grateful just to be allowed to stay at the academy and thank him for his understanding. Then the rector turned his gaze to Ash. He announced that His Majesty the King had given him a letter and asked him to review its contents later. Ash, taking the envelope with the black wax seal in his hands, asked in astonishment if the letter was really from the king. He already had a feeling this wouldn't end well. The rector dismissed them, saying that was all and they were free to go. Ash and Fina bowed politely, said goodbye to the rector, and left the office. Upon returning to the mansion, they sat down at the dining table. Ash twirled his fork thoughtfully in his hands, staring into space. Fina sat across from him. Finally, she couldn't take it anymore and asked what exactly was written in that letter. Ash replied that it said she was being awarded the Order of the Hero, and he was being granted the title of Viscount. Fina's mouth fell open in surprise, and she asked, "So, does that mean he'll become a Viscount, and we have a reason to celebrate?" However, Ash shook his head and explained grimly that this was a price for his silence. Ash began to explain the structure of this world's social hierarchy. Pointing to the very bottom of the hierarchy, he explained that in this country, a promotion in title was an extraordinary event. This was especially true for a family of baronets who didn't even have the means to establish a collateral branch. As the second son, he was destined to remain a commoner in the future unless he married into another family. He unfolded the letter and read its contents aloud. The letter stated that, as an exception, he would be made a Viscount, provided with money and status, but in return he must forget about dueling and keep his mouth shut. The letter clearly specified that this was the condition of the deal. After listening to him, Fina lowered her gaze to her hands, clasped on her lap. She said quietly that she now understood why Ash had been so downcast. Ash, however, forced a smile and remarked that she could at least rejoice in her Order of the Hero without any ulterior motives. After all, the Order of the Hero is the highest honor available even to commoners, and it comes with an annual stipend. Fina was surprised by this. Then Ash shifted his gaze to the letter and, taking a sip of water, added that it also stated, her award ceremony and his investiture as a Viscount would take place immediately after the announcement of the top students based on the results of the general exams. He paused for a moment, then, setting the glass down on the table, remarked that it would be nice for them to rank higher so as not to be an eyesore to others. Ash leaned back in his chair and, looking at Fina, asked, "What's her usual ranking?" The girl stared at the floor, embarrassed, her cheeks turning slightly pink, and she hesitated before replying that she needed a little time to think it over. Ash waited patiently. Finally, she handed him a sheet with her grades. Ash took it, scanned it, and, letting out an involuntary sigh, noticed that at best she was at the bottom of the list. He added that it was a good thing this academy didn't make students repeat a year, and he reflected on the fact that the comprehensive exam consisted of 3 parts: theory, fencing, and magic. In fencing and magic, Fina, despite all of Elise's scheming, was performing quite decently. Ash sighed, ran a hand through his hair, and realized that the problem lay in the theory. Speaking in the terms of his past world, he explained that this wasn't even a pour, but rather a fail. He turned to Fina and firmly told her that she needed to hit the books immediately. The girl flinched as if she'd been caught off guard, and she replied quietly that she already understood. The day the theoretical exam results were announced arrived. The academy's hallways were filled with the usual bustle. Students crowded around the bulletin boards, some shouting with joy, others, on the contrary, sighing dejectedly. Ash stood a little apart from the crowd, looking over his own results. He smiled slightly and noticed that his grades were higher than last year's. He added that, apparently, it's true what they say. When you teach someone else, you begin to understand the material better yourself. Just then, a group of students walked past them. One of them, talking to a friend, remarked loudly that a freshman had achieved the highest score in absolutely every subject. The other, whistling in surprise, asked, "Is this really the first time in history?" and thought to himself that this must be some kind of genius. Ash, overhearing this conversation, couldn't help but grow wary. He understood perfectly well that, in theory, getting the highest grade in even a single subject was incredibly difficult. And then an alarming thought flashed through his mind. This was only possible if this person possessed knowledge from past life. And he thought that this freshman was also a reincarnator. Just then, Fina called out to him. Ash turned around. He asked her how she'd done. Fina, stumbling over her words, handed him a sheet of paper. Ash took the document, glanced over it, and immediately exclaimed in surprise that it was much better than before. Hearing his praise, the girl broke into a happy smile and said it was all thanks to his help and lessons. Ash, looking at her beaming face, felt slightly embarrassed and looked away. He reflected that he had merely helped her memorize likely questions and work through a pile of past exams. But the secret to her success lay in the fact that she had a naturally good memory. Ash smiled and pointed out that she was mistaken. All of this was the result of her own hard work. Fina tried to object, but he cut her off, adding that thanks to their studying together, his own grades had improved as well. Fina, clasping her hands together, timidly asked if she could ask for a reward for her efforts. Ash raised an eyebrow in surprise, but then smiled gently and asked what exactly she'd like to receive. The girl, blushing slightly, admitted that she'd like to replace the old kitchenware in the mansion. Ash asked in surprise, "What exactly do you want to replace?" Fina, fidgeting with her fingers in embarrassment, replied that she'd like to replace every single item. Ash paused to think for a moment, then, folding his arms across his chest with a slight smirk, asked, "Everything, without exception?" Fina, smiling happily and closing her eyes, nodded affirmatively, confirming her desire to completely renovate the kitchen. The city streets were bustling with their usual hustle and bustle. Ash and Fina were picking out kitchenware. Fina, noticing his confusion, stepped closer and, seeing what he had picked up, shook her head, indicating that it wasn't what they needed. With a gesture, she asked him to put the item back where it belonged. Ash obediently put it back, and they continued on their way with their purchases. He was carrying a massive wooden crate, and Fina, walking beside him, tilted her head slightly. She realized it was already too late to bring it up, but she still worried whether they'd make it into the top 10 with scores like these. Ash smiled and told her not to worry. If they did well in the practical fencing and magic tests, everything would be fine. Fina, feeling a little calmer, said with a slight smile that if he said so, then they really would be able to. As they passed another shop, Ash suddenly stopped, looked back at her, and remarked with a warm smile that she was, it turned out, very thrifty. Fina blinked in confusion and asked him to repeat himself in surprise. Ash chuckled and added that if it weren't for her, he would have just blown his entire fortune at that shop. The girl smiled in response. Then, with a serious look, she said that if he kept spending money so thoughtlessly, they'd both end up wandering the world. Ash, thoughtfully rubbing his chin, agreed that she was right and promised to be more careful from now on. Then, with a slight smile, he added that she was just like a real wife. Taken by surprise, the girl's eyes widened, and she gasped in amazement. Ash turned to her and said gently that she was very caring and could do absolutely everything in the world. He added that whoever married her would be incredibly happy. Having said this, Ash gazed thoughtfully ahead and, mentally recalling yesterday's events, noted that, come to think of it, His Highness Alberich and the other guys had missed out on a real treasure. Fina lowered her head, clutched the collar of her shirt, and quietly, almost inaudibly, repeated the word wife to herself. His words echoed in her head, and she blushed deeply. Ash, noticing that she had fallen silent, realized he might have said too much. He spun around to face her, apologized nervously, and said that it must have been unpleasant for her to hear that, and that he'd just blurted it out without thinking. Fina looked up at him, waved her hands hurriedly, and began to assure him that she wasn't upset at all. She said he shouldn't pay any attention to it and try to smile. However, at that moment, two passers-by walked past them. One of them, turning to his companion, asked loudly if he'd heard the news. That, according to rumors, the situation in the Republic was heating up. The second added that the rebels and the former government were all long gone. The first man said that new factions were emerging there, and the infighting showed no signs of abating. He warned that even trade caravans would be better off staying away. Ash, who had involuntarily overheard their conversation, frowned. He knew that the Republic was a southern nation that had once been ruled by a monarchy, but that military unrest had persisted there ever since the revolution. He mentally replayed the game's storyline. There were no further details about this in Kazuru, so he wasn't aware of the specifics. This alarmed him. Meanwhile, Fina once again murmured thoughtfully to herself that she was a wife. Then she chuckled quietly and continued to follow Ash. Sometime later, the day of the long-awaited practical exams at the academy had arrived. A tense atmosphere of anticipation reigned inside the spacious stone hall with its high arches. Two men stood out among the crowd of students, standing a little apart. a gray, bearded court mage in loose white robes, and a holy swordsman in a dark cloak and armor. As the herald explained, today's practical exam in magic and fencing was being held jointly for all courses and classes. Participant numbers were assigned at random to eliminate any bias. Ash stood in line, calmly waiting for his turn, when an announcement blared from the speakers. Next number, 43, Ash Laban. He heard his name called. With a brief nod, he made his way to the center of the stone arena, where a monster-shaped target was already in place. One of the examiners handed him a slender training staff, explaining that, to ensure the experiment's integrity, the Academy provided everyone with identical tools so that only the candidate's individual skills would be evaluated. Ash took the wand and concentrated. The examiner gestured toward the target and asked him to unleash the most powerful magic he was capable of. Ash, after assessing the distance and surroundings, raised the wand and began mentally combining the elements. The evaluation was supposed to take into account the spell's power, casting speed, and other factors on a 100-point scale. He decided to blend fire, water, and wind right in the air, creating a complex magical combination. A low rumble swept through the hall, and the sky outside the tall windows suddenly darkened. Frightened cries rang out among the spectators standing around the arena. Some asked, "What on earth is happening?" Others pointed in horror at the blackened sky. One of the students, clutching her uniform, prayed in panic for the goddess to save them. Ash, hearing these cries and feeling the frightened stares upon him, frowned slightly. He realized that the cumulonimbus cloud he had created could only unleash about 60% of his true power, but he didn't want to cause any unnecessary commotion. However, there was no time to hesitate. He waved his wand, and a powerful beam of magic struck the center of the target. The sky cleared and returned to normal, but the target remained standing in place. The court magician asked his assistant to replace the target. The assistant asked for clarification, and the man, poking at the target, explained that it was no good. The very moment his hand touched the target, it began to crumble. The examiner, approaching the remains of the target, remarked in surprise that not even several court magicians working together would have been able to break through this barrier. The man replied that the target had been destroyed, and that was a fact. Ash felt extremely awkward about the situation. He apologized and asked what his score was. The court mage replied, 100 points. After all, casting such a powerful spell with only 2 attributes was something never seen before. The man turned to Ash and asked if he wanted to become a court mage after graduation. Ash smiled wearily, waved the offer aside, and said he would think it over for now. Ash stepped aside and reflected on how unexpected the result was for him and how he would now be able to rise to a high position. Soon, a new announcement rang out. The next contestant, number 54, Fina Stott. The girl, who was already standing at the ready, heard her name, gathered herself, and stepped into the arena. Fina picked up her training staff and took a deep breath. Then, with a sharp swing of the staff, she summoned a multitude of magic circles. With a soft whistle, a beam of light shot toward the target, easily piercing the protective barrier. The examiner, checking the device, announced that Fina Stott had scored 95 points. Upon hearing the result, the girl exhaled with relief and pressed her hand to her chest, feeling the tension melt away. The crowd of spectators immediately began whispering among themselves. Some asked what on earth was going on this year. Others marveled that they had never seen such light magic before. Ash silently praised her performance, noting to himself that she had done an excellent job. He knew he had only helped her with her training, but all these skills were entirely Fina's own doing. However, his thoughts were interrupted by an excited voice from the side. Someone in the audience pointed toward the arena and asked the others to look that way. Ash looked over and saw the student, without using her staff, unleash a powerful water-based attack that struck its target at an unbelievable, insane speed. But what struck him most was something else. He noticed that it's usually impossible to wield basic magic of the 5 elements without the aid of a focus, since the staff takes over all the computational functions during casting. Even Fina herself had deliberately used her staff today to avoid drawing unnecessary attention to herself. But now this girl had demonstrated something different. Ash, resting his hand on his chin, concluded that she simply had amazing control over magical energy. At that very moment, the results for the student named Saresa Enforcer were announced, and she scored 90 points. The crowd immediately began to whisper among themselves. Someone asked in surprise, "Isn't this the very same freshman from the rumors who scored the highest in every subject?" Others, lowering their voices, asked in bewilderment from which family she came. After all, getting such high scores in both theory and magic was simply too much. Ash, too, let his gaze linger on her and wondered thoughtfully, could she also be a reincarnator, just like me? However, his thoughts were interrupted by a new announcement. The herald loudly informed everyone that the fencing exam for Einmoref was about to begin. In the stone arena, paved with large slabs, stood a massive training golem in heavy armor, holding a huge sword in its hands. The rules were strict. Students fought the golem one-on-one. The fight ended when either the barrier was destroyed, one of the combatants' weapons was knocked out of their hand, or the student dropped their sword or surrendered. Ein, taking his blade in hand, prepared for the battle. A short while later, Fina approached Ash and congratulated him on passing the test, to which he nodded gratefully. Then Ash asked what her score was on the fencing exam. Fina replied that hers was 440, and as far as she remembered, his was 441. Fina said she had just run into Ein. She added with concern that he looked rather gloomy and asked if everything was all right with him. Upon hearing this, Ash paused for a moment, then explained that Ein was currently going through a difficult family situation. He explained that, according to Ein himself, some old man from a collateral branch of the family was trying to take control of his family in order to claim the title. But the worst part, according to Ash, wasn't that. The old man intended to marry Ein's younger sister, who was only 10 years old. Ash added that this was exactly why Ein had to become the best at the academy and protect his sister, and that he had already asked Ein for help with his magic training. Fina, after listening to him until the end, looked at him intently and said she understood now. Ash noted that Ein had done very well on the magic exam. He smiled and added that Ein would be just fine. At that moment, the battle began in the arena. Ein confidently knocked the sword out of the golem's hands. The announcer, standing at the edge of the arena, loudly proclaimed the result. Einmoref, 82 points. The announcer's voice rang out across the arena, introducing the next contestant. He called out number 315, Sarasa Enforcer, loudly, inviting her to step forward. Sarasa made her way slowly toward the center of the arena. As she passed the stands, she waved her hand and irritably asked the crowd to stop making noise, stating that she understood everything perfectly well without all the fuss. Ash, watching her from the sidelines, quietly remarked to Fina that this girl, by all appearances, had once again found herself the center of everyone's attention. Sarasa stopped, staring at the sword. Then she put it down and said she was giving up because she physically couldn't lift anything heavier than a feather. Standing next to her was the disconcerted examiner's assistant, who asked in astonishment if she was serious. Sarasa, her expression unchanged, replied that she was absolutely serious. She added that she had come to this academy solely to study magic, and that an assessment of her swordsmanship would bring her no satisfaction. With that, she turned and calmly walked away, leaving the stunned spectators behind her. Ash, watching her receding back, thoughtfully scratched his chin, wondering what she was thinking. And he decided that, in any case, it was best not to let his guard down. Fina tugged lightly on his sleeve and said it was almost time for them to leave. Ash nodded in agreement, and the two of them left the stands, heading toward the exit to the arena. Suddenly, someone called out to Ash and asked him to look down. It was Sarasa. Ash asked, with a hint of surprise, if it was really her. Sarasa looked up and said that it was indeed her, then asked sarcastically who else she could possibly look like. Ash apologized and replied that she had appeared so unexpectedly. Sarasa waved it off, saying it was no big deal. Their conversation quickly turned to a more serious topic. Sarasa, fixing Ash with a steady gaze, said that she was much more interested in the magic he had demonstrated during the exam. She explained that creating a massive thundercloud and summoning a colossal bolt of lightning was something entirely new, going beyond the scope of all existing theories of magic. She was convinced that simply mixing the elements would not, in and of itself, produce such a phenomenon, and that such a feat would be impossible without a perfect visualization of the entire process and the final result. Her eyes burned with genuine interest. Ash, feeling her intensity, was a little flustered, and Sarasa, noticing this, smiled and demanded that he explain how he'd come up with it. And who was his mentor? At that moment, Fina interrupted the conversation. She said it was time for their exam and asked Sarasa to save all her questions for later. However, without turning around, Sarasa coldly retorted, addressing Fina directly, that when she wanted to know something, it had to happen immediately. She then added that she was also interested in Fina's light magic, but for now, she preferred to question Ash first. The atmosphere around them grew tense. Sarasa stood her ground, unwilling to back down, but Fina, gathering her courage, repeated that this was no reason to hold them up before the exam. Hearing this, Sarasa sighed. With a slight smirk, she remarked that, as regrettable as it was, she would back down this time. She turned and walked away in the opposite direction, leaving them alone. When Sarasa was out of sight, Fina breathed a sigh of relief and, pressing her hand to her chest, whispered that, thank goodness, they'd made it through. Then she added sheepishly that she was sorry for interfering when she hadn't been asked to. Ash, hearing this, smiled gently and shook his head. He replied that she hadn't interfered at all. On the contrary, she'd saved him from an awkward situation and sincerely thanked her for her support. Fina, hearing his words, blushed slightly and smiled back. A loud voice rang out from the arena's announcer. He announced number 441, Ash Laban, inviting him to step into the arena. Hearing his name, Ash calmly made his way to the center of the arena. Ash pondered his next move. He decided that, to start with, he would put all his strength into a single sword strike, and then he'd see what happened. With that, he gripped the hilt of his sword tightly and stepped forward. Then he raised his sword to strike, and he swung it, convinced that the golem would surely be unable to dodge it. In the next instant, a deafening crash rang out. The golem let out a screeching sound, as if its metallic body couldn't withstand the colossal pressure. And then it literally crumbled into tiny pieces. Ash stared at the debris in amazement. He couldn't believe his eyes and asked himself in confusion, what just happened? He thought to himself that this was, of course, great, but he just hoped they wouldn't make him retake the test because he'd broken the equipment. A deathly silence fell over the arena, which was immediately broken by the agitated voice of one of the assistants. He suggested fearfully that perhaps a mistake had been made while operating the golem, in which case the student would have to retake the exam. However, the holy swordsman standing next to him sternly cut him off. He firmly stated that there was no mistake and that this young man had indeed destroyed the golem solely through his own strength. The assistant, stunned by his words, stammered, "What do you mean by that?" The holy swordsman, with barely concealed admiration, explained that Ash had torn the golem to shreds with nothing but the force of his sword swing. He added that it was hard to even imagine a young man of his age capable of such a feat at that moment. Another herald ran up to the stands, holding a summary of the results. He apologized to everyone present for the delay and announced loudly that the final results had just been announced. Ash Laban received 99 points. Ash himself, standing at the edge of the arena and hearing his score, breathed a sigh of relief and even involuntarily repeated the number to himself, feeling the tension melt away. A short while later, the three friends had gathered in the spacious living room of Ash's mansion. Sunlight streamed through the tall windows, illuminating the set table, which was laden with light snacks, pies, and several pitchers of drinks. Ash raised a mug of warm drink and proposed a toast to their excellent results. Ein, sitting across from him, enthusiastically echoed his toast and shouted, "Hurrah!" Based on the results of the general exams, Ash took first place overall. Fina demonstrated brilliant technique in fencing and scored 93 points, taking second place. Ein also received high scores in all subjects and came in fourth. Summing up, Ash said that, as a result, all three had made it into the top ranks and received an invitation to the award ceremony. Fina, beaming, exclaimed that Ash was simply incredible, to which Ein laughed and agreed, adding that even he hadn't expected his friend to be so cool. Ash just laughed sheepishly in response. Then the conversation turned to preparations for the upcoming ceremony. Ein, thoughtfully stroking his chin, asked Ash if he had a formal suit for such an event. Ash shrugged and replied that he would wear his older brother's old tailcoat, the one he'd worn to the orientation ceremony. Ein sighed enviously and remarked that he was lucky to have older brothers, since he could hand-me-downs from them, even though wearing a tailcoat was always a hassle. Ash nodded in understanding and said there was nothing to be done about it. The awards ceremony for the top students is held under the patronage of His Majesty the King, so a dress code is implied by default. This time, Crown Prince Elsa's is serving as the organizer, but that doesn't make the event any less formal. Fina, who had been listening intently to their conversation, timidly raised her hand and asked if she could attend this ceremony in her regular school uniform. Ash, upon hearing her question, raised an eyebrow in surprise and then shook his head seriously. He reminded her that this was an official reception hosted by the royal family and, moreover, there would be a ball at the end, so formal attire was mandatory. Fina, realizing this, slumped her shoulders in disappointment. Ein, noticing her dejected state, asked sympathetically if she really didn't have a dress at all. Fina lowered her head guiltily and quietly admitted that she truly didn't. Ash, upon hearing this, paused to think for a moment. He mentally replayed memories of the game and recalled that there had been a special event where Fina bought a dress. If he remembered correctly, she had gone shopping with the person who had the highest affection level. Ash smiled at his own thoughts, then turned to Fina and said firmly that, in any case, since she would be receiving the hero's medal after the ceremony, there was no way she could show up in her school uniform. Fina looked at him in surprise, not understanding what he was getting at. Before she could recover, Ash calmly announced that they would go buy her a dress tomorrow morning. Upon hearing his words, Fina's eyes widened, and she froze in astonishment, unable to utter a single word. The next morning, after their conversation about the dress, Ash headed to the Adventurers Guild. The receptionist greeted him at the counter. She politely asked what brought him to the guild today. Ash explained that he had come to withdraw money and asked her to give him 5 million gold pieces. The girl, not the least bit surprised, nodded and asked him to wait a minute while she prepared the amount. While waiting, Ash noticed that the guild had a special bank for adventurers, which was very convenient, since any adventurer could open an account there without any hassle. As he stood at the counter, snippets of a conversation between two men sitting nearby reached his ears. One of them, lowering his voice, asked his companion what he was going to do about the job he'd been offered. The second man replied thoughtfully that the Principality of Leuven was gathering adventurers, but he didn't understand why they were doing it. The first man leaned in closer and explained that, according to rumors, they were planning to join forces with the Republic and attack their country. Upon hearing this, Ash instinctively grew wary, but continued to stand with an impassive expression. One of the men went on to say that the Principality of Leuven needed their adventurers, who knew the terrain well and could jump right into battle. The second man was surprised and pointed out that the Principality already had plenty of military might. And rumor has it that there are even some among the nobility who have made a pact with the devil. Ash was surprised, but then he remembered that in the game, several nobles had appeared who had made a pact with the devil for the sake of wealth and glory. He surmised that the demons they summoned were as powerful as the bosses themselves. Soon the clerk returned and handed him a heavy pouch, apologizing for keeping him waiting. Ash took the money, but his mind was already preoccupied with what he'd heard. He would have liked to ask the men more about it, but he realized that now was not the time. Fina was waiting, so he briefly thanked the girl. Fina was already waiting for him outside. When Ash approached, she asked if he had finished his business. Ash nodded and replied that he'd withdrawn the money without any problems. Then he glanced at her casual clothes, a light jacket and a simple shirt, and remarked with a smile that he was used to seeing her in her school uniform or an apron, so this outfit looked unexpectedly fresh. Fina looked away, embarrassed, but a faint smile played on her lips. They walked down the shopping street, and Fina, glancing around every now and then, was clearly feeling awkward. Ash asked if she'd spotted any shops yet. The girl shook her head in confusion, admitting that she had absolutely no idea where to start. Then Ash, noticing a street stall with steaming kebabs, suggested they grab a bite to eat since they were here anyway. Fina, looking at the appetizing pieces of meat on the skewers, timidly said that she'd like to try exactly that. Ash bought 2 skewers, handed her one, and warned her to be careful because the meat was still hot off the grill. Fina gratefully accepted the treat. She took a bite. She smiled contentedly and said it was very tasty. Seeing her joy, Ash remarked that that was great. As they stood there enjoying their meal, Fina brought up their plans for the rest of the day. She asked where they were headed. Ash pointed to the majestic building at the end of the street. It was Pinocchio, a large shopping complex for the aristocracy. Ash calmly explained that, in addition to high-end boutiques, there was a casino and all kinds of entertainment venues. In the game, it was a place where you could change your character's appearance or play minigames. He added confidently that they would definitely find a suitable dress there. When they entered the Pinocchio shopping complex, Fina froze at the threshold. She let out a breath of admiration, noticing that it really was incredibly luxurious inside. She was even slightly overwhelmed by the sheer scale of it all. They hadn't even taken a couple of steps when a group of employees in elegant uniforms approached them. One of the female sales associates cheerfully congratulated them on being the shopping center's 10,000th visitor. In honor of this occasion, they were presented with a special ticket for a challenge. Ash and Fina exchanged surprised glances. The consultant, beaming with a smile, explained that this ticket could either be exchanged for 100,000 gold pieces or used to participate in a special challenge. If they passed the trial, they would also receive a coupon that could be exchanged for absolutely any item in the complex. The girl politely asked which option they would choose. Upon hearing this, Ash fell deep in thought. He recalled that in the original game, there was a hidden event, the trial for the 10,000th visitor, Pinocchio. To receive the reward, one had to complete a randomly selected, highly difficult minigame. He turned to Fina and asked what they should do. The girl picked up the ticket, looked at it curiously, and then, noticing his slight smile, replied resolutely that she'd like to give it a try. Seeing her determination, Ash asked if she was sure she could handle it. Fina paused for a moment, but then said quietly yet firmly that she could do it. She clenched the ticket in her palm and declared that she accepted the challenge. The staff member gave an approving nod and led them into a separate room. There, in the center of the spacious room, stood a giant hemisphere simulating the night sky. Dozens of glowing spheres lit up above them, twinkling like stars. The consultant explained that they were about to undergo a challenge called the Flight of a Shooting Star. The rules were simple but required precision. They had to charge a special bow with mana to create arrows. And within 5 minutes, they had to shoot down all the glowing spheres, 1 arrow per sphere. They were allowed only 2 attempts. Fina, taking the elegant bow in her hands, listened carefully to the instructions, and said she was ready. Ash recalled that this was the hidden event, the flight of a shooting star. The number of arrows, reload speed, and other parameters depended on mana and intelligence. Ash noted to himself that with Fina's current stats, completing the challenge shouldn't be too difficult, but he still watched her actions closely. Time ran out, and Fina looked at Ash in confusion and quietly said that she had only taken down half the targets. And now she didn't know what to do. Ash, noticing her despair, stepped closer. He gently told her that the secret to this game wasn't about targeting each sphere individually. He explained that she needed to put more power into her bow and shoot with the intention of taking them all out at once. Upon hearing this, Fina gathered her focus, took a deep breath, and told herself that this time she would try to take them all down at once. She charged her bow with mana once more, this time with much greater power. Taking aim, she released the arrow. A blinding burst of light erupted. A powerful energy wave swept through the hall, and all the glowing spheres, one after another, went out, vanishing into thin air. Fina lowered her bow and froze for a moment. Then, realizing she'd succeeded, she exclaimed joyfully, turning to Ash. The boy, looking at her beaming face, smiled approvingly and congratulated her on her victory. The clerk, who reappeared before them, handed them the promised coupon. Fina, looking at the beautiful card with gold embossing, smiled shyly and asked which dress she should choose now. A little while later, Ash handed her a small ice cream cone and told her to hold on to it. Fina looked at the treat in surprise and asked if it was really for her. Ash nodded and, with a slight smile, added that she should eat it quickly before it melted. The girl gratefully accepted the ice cream and, after taking a bite, smiled contentedly, saying it was very delicious. A little later, Ash noted that they'd bought everything they needed and could now just relax. However, Fina, still clutching the coupon in her hands, frowned slightly and asked if everything would go smoothly with tomorrow's ceremony. Ash, noticing her anxiety, shook his head and gently advised her not to worry. He said it was better to think of it as a celebration rather than a difficult ordeal, and to just try to have fun. Fina, hearing his words, nodded and replied that she would try. In the dungeon of the royal castle, the masked man calmly looked at Elise standing before him and, folding his arms across his chest, declared that he was listening closely. Then, with a cold smirk, he asked how she had managed to discover the location of the sacred sword. Elise turned pale, clutched the collar of her uniform, and exclaimed in a trembling voice that this was impossible. And how dare such a commoner even ask such questions? The masked man, without changing his tone, calmly explained that, first and foremost, her engagement to His Highness Alberich had been annulled by decree of His Majesty the King. The same applied to her engagements to the 3 other noble houses. He added that she was now nothing more than a commoner who had stolen a national treasure, and that the situation was even worse than she could have imagined. Upon hearing this, Elise clenched her fists and, making no attempt to hide her rage, shouted that it was a lie and that such a thing simply could not be true. The masked man merely chuckled quietly, realizing that this played right into his hands. Elise, breathing heavily, stammered, "What on earth are you talking about?" The stranger took a step forward, smiled menacingly, and assured her that she needn't worry. He wouldn't defile her purity. However, he added that it was far more to his liking to watch her writhe in agony. With that, he held up a small glass bottle containing a murky liquid and explained that it wasn't such a big deal. After all, minor wounds could be healed with this wonderful potion. Elise, staring at the bottle, recoiled in horror and screamed. Soon, Elise, barely able to stand and with her mind clouded, was led into a small room. When Alberich saw her, he jumped to his feet, ran over, grabbed her by the shoulders, and asked anxiously how she was feeling. The girl, barely managing to raise her clouded eyes to him, whispered in a trembling voice that she remembered everything from her past life. Alberich, frozen for a moment, quietly asked her to repeat it. At that moment, Elsa's entered the room. He said that, after all, there was nothing more beautiful than a touching reunion. Elsa's, glancing at the disheveled and frightened Elise, remarked that she looked full of energy. Recon called out to the gentleman. He asked how long they would be staying there. Elsa's turned toward the door and said they still had some things to do, adding that they had to be ready to leave at any moment. Then he left the room. After the door closed behind Elise, Alberich asked how she was doing. Recon replied quietly that he couldn't believe what he was seeing. He explained that, by all appearances, she had been methodically maimed, and her wounds had been healed time and time again. Recon swallowed hard and added that this had clouded her mind. Upon hearing this, Alberich clenched his fists and growled through gritted teeth. "Is this how people behave?" He then asked if there was any way to use magic. Recon sighed heavily, shook his head, and grimly remarked that it was useless. As soon as he tried to cast a spell, someone instantly drained his mana. Albrecht clicked his tongue, and he punched the wall. He hurled a curse at those scum, accusing them of winning unfairly by using underhanded tricks in the duel. He was convinced that it was all their fault, that everything had gone to hell, and he swore he would make them pay, no matter what it cost him. His voice trembled with rage, and his eyes burned with determination. Albrecht, breathing heavily, asked irritably if there really was no other way to get out of here. At that moment, a polite voice from behind the door announced that dinner was served. Albrecht flung open the doors and stepped out into the hallway. However, after taking a few steps, he stopped, noticing that no one was on guard duty. He asked the man standing nearby, suspiciously, why he was here alone. After all, a knight usually stood guard. The stranger, dressed in a plain vest and a white shirt, replied with a polite smile that he was on their side. He assured him that could help them escape the country, and added that they had the means to heal Lady Elise's wounds. Albrecht, looking at him warily, said nothing. Noticing the stranger's hesitation, smiled again and asked him to calm down, assuring him that everything would be all right. Meanwhile, the day of the awards ceremony had arrived. The Ash Mansion was a hive of activity. Fina, dressed in an elegant black off-the-shoulder gown with a dainty bow at her neck, stood in front of a large mirror. She nervously fiddled with the cuffs of her long gloves and, turning to Ash standing beside her, asked shyly, "How do I look?" Ash, dressed in a formal black tailcoat. He froze for a moment, staring at her. He couldn't utter a word, and silence hung in the room. Finally, he stepped closer to her, lowered his gaze, and softly said that she was beautiful. Hearing his soft voice, Fina blushed all the way to the roots of her hair and, lowering her eyes, quietly thanked him. Then Ash held out his hand to her, and Fina, trembling slightly, placed her palm in his. He squeezed her fingers and said with a smile that it was time for them to go. Fina looked up at him with a beaming gaze and nodded in response. To be continued. Thanks for watching. Write your feedback in the comments. If you like the story, please like and subscribe. See you soon.